All right, Joel Gausten here from joelgausten.com. As I move forward with these Jersey-centric interviews, I couldn't keep going without bringing on somebody who uh, he and I were just talking. We haven't had a face-to-face conversation in at least 20 years. So long overdue. It's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Myke Hideous. Myke, great to see you, man.
Thank you, Joel. It was very kind of you. Thank you. Nice to see you. As you just mentioned, how we were talking off air, so to speak. Yeah, it's been a long time, and the little small world comments that we were talking about, and how this works out and that works out, and this guy I know, and that guy I know, and that lady I know. So yeah, it's a pretty small world.
Yeah, absolutely, ma'am. I wanted to have you on because I've been having a lot of conversations with people from the late 80s slash early 90s New Jersey underground music scene. As I know you know, I've been doing a series with our pal Emilio from the Pipeline as one
Yep,
example.
I
You know,
watched that.
yeah, just kind of representing an era that I think sometimes gets perhaps a bit overlooked. People, we had the big punk explosion and then we had grunge in the 90s. But I know growing up in that era in Jersey, there was a really rich history with a lot of very interesting bands and interesting clubs. So one of my goals is to revisit those times with what I do on this channel. Um, and I should preface this conversation by letting the viewer know, uh, Myke, you do have a book, which I believe is now in its third edition. That book is called King of an Empire to the Shoes of a Misfit. And the book, which I'm a big fan of, the book goes through the entire history of your life as a musician in and out of New Jersey.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't want to give away too much of the store with the book here because I want people to check out what you've published. It's an interesting tale, especially if you're a fan of the Misfits, who you sang for at one point in time, which we'll get into a little bit in this conversation. I can't recommend it enough. So I figure we're going to kind of look at maybe, I would say, maybe the first 5 years of your primary band for many years, the Empire Hideous,
Right.
because that kind of falls into the timeline. So, kind of starting off pre-Empire Hideous, I know you were going to shows in the scene pretty early on. Um, People who have Erie Vaughn's book, for example, there's a photo of a Sam Haines set list from Danceteria in 1985, which is your set list.
That's right. Does
Uh,
it say it? Does it say it in the is there any mention of that? Because I saw the picture, but I never read about it, whether or not they mentioned that it came from me. Did they say that?
I can't recall, but it's possible. I'll have to check.
Probably not.
I've got the book
Probably not.
somewhere here. But that is your set list.
That
And
is my set list. I sold it online after my whole Misfits stint. I sold all my Misfits collection, everything. I was just done with them. And I happened to find that set list in my Sam Hain Initium album. It was the first time I saw them. That was at Danceteria in New York City. I'll never forget that night. I got in so much trouble when I came home. I came home at like 5 o'clock in the morning. I was like, my father was like, "Where the hell are you?" Dad, I was at the Sam Hain show. Crack. But yeah, I was still young. I was only like, what was I, 18, 19? I don't even remember. Probably 19. And yeah, so anyway, yeah, that was my set list, or set list from the show.
so, being a Jersey guy at that point in time, it perhaps goes without saying, you were pretty deep into that whole scene, that whole kind of what sprung from Lodi, that whole Misfits Sam Hain vibe. That was really your thing from, I'd imagine, from your first introduction, all that stuff, right?
Well, I mean, the way I got into it, for me, music started to get more intriguing when I was about, I'd say about 15, 16. I went from the young age of getting into like heavy metal and the standard like AC/DC, Judas Priest, Van Halen, what else? Kiss was also a big favorite of mine. So just the standards. but I didn't know the underground yet. I didn't know the underground until I was about 17, when I was able to drive and go to places like record stores and pick up new punk band stuff. And believe it or not, uh, there was that crowd from Lodi. There was a guy named, of course, Erie. Then there was a guy named Myke Hideous, a guy named Bruce Benjamin. Bruce was actually in a band called Rosemary's Babies uh, with Erie. And I used to work with Bruce at Pathmark in Fair Lawn, New Jersey, and he turned me on to some new types of music. In fact, even Erie, like I learned about Jim Fetus or Jim Thurwell, scraping Fetus off the wheel. I learned about him. I learned about Susie and the Banshees. I learned about Bauhaus, and these were also coming from Glenn Danzig, who was turning on like Erie to these bands, especially Jim Thurwell and all that. And then it'd go from Erie to Myke and Bruce, and then they would come to me and tell me about it. Especially Bruce. Bruce got me into hardcore punk rock, Bad Brains, Minor Threat, the FUs, and as well as like what is it? Stiff Little Fingers? No, Stiff Fingers. Is that right? I can't remember. Yeah, Stiff Little Fingers, the Stranglers, the Buzzcocks. So they opened up a whole new door for me, and I started going, like when I was in high school, I went from heavy metal to new wave. And when I was working at that job at age 16, 17, that's when I knew Bruce. And then all this new music started coming into my life. So that's sort of how I got into it. And then little by little, once I knew the Misfits, and by that time they were already broken up. I learned about them in '84. But by that time, Sam Hain was already going. And then Bruce introduced me to Erie. And then, I drove them to the show that night, the Danzig show, not Danzig, the Danceteria show. Like, Erie came with me. In fact, he left his snare drum in my car for who's the drummer at the time? Steve Zing. Anyway, long story. But anyway, yeah, I started getting into all that different style of music and the culture. Then once I knew the Misfits, it opened up a whole new doorway for me. And knowing that they were from Lodi was a big deal. So, yeah, that's pretty much the story of how I got into that.
So was the Empire Hideous your first band out of the gate?
Now, I was in a band with a guy named Kenny Balone, who ended up playing for MOD.
Right.
We had a band called Angry Corpses, which was a combination of like hardcore punk rock, mostly hardcore punk rock, but we were also Misfits fans. In fact, the guitar player Kenny and myself, we had the devil lock hair thing going on. Mind you, it was short, but it was still prevalently there. So that was my first band. And by the time we were going to play our first show, I forget what happened. I couldn't end up playing for the band anymore, and that was the end of that. We split up. Kenny died. I don't know if you heard about that, but Kenny died not too long ago.
I did, yeah.
So you know who he is. Okay.
Sure.
So yeah, that was my first band. In fact, the drummer, Frank Nasta, he ended up playing for my... All right, so when I started Empire Hideous, I had a guy named Don Ferratu. And Don, years later, started a rockabilly band called the Tombstones, and Frank Nasta was the drummer for that band.
I remember them. Yeah.
Good band.
All the names you just mentioned, actually. Yeah.
Yep.
Fantastic. So when was the initial lineup of the Empire Hideous put together? This would have been, if I'm guessing, 87. Do I have that right?
All right, so how did this work? All right, so in 86, was it 86? Gee, I'm sorry. Give me a second to think here. I ended up having health problems. I ended up getting cancer. And I'm trying to think if it was before that. No, it wasn't before then. No, it was. It was before then I got my first bout of cancer. And at that time, I was only 20 years old. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble remembering. I'll make it easy. Basically, I'll never forget. I was at home, and you remember the Fiends?
Sure. Oh yeah.
Oh, all right. So I knew them very
Played in
well.
the Fiends.
You played in the Fiends. Okay. So I used to go to see them at the Rat Trap Cafe in Prospect Park, New Jersey. That was my first club experience because I was underage. So they used to put me on their mailing list, and I'm not bragging or anything, but they used to think I was like this big rock star. And they were always like, "Hey, Mike," back then I wasn't Myke Hideous. I went by my real last name, Mike Malzone. So they just knew me as this popular guy from Patterson who was a Misfit fan. So one day I get an envelope in the mail, and it was a button, like, that you put on your jacket or something. It was the Fiends, along with their daily newsletter or weekly or monthly newsletter. So I get that newsletter, and I open it up, and I'm reading it, and I'm looking at the button, and I'm like, if they could do a band, I can do a band. And from that point, I remember what it was now. I did have a problem. I was sick. I was in the hospital. And when I came out, I had got that's right. I was home. I got that letter because I couldn't drive anywhere. I wasn't allowed to drive being sick. And that's when I decided I was going to do a band. I didn't know anything about music. I didn't know how to sing. I never wrote a song. I never wrote lyrics in my life. Nothing. And so I bought a cheap Casio keyboard and I began to write music. And the whole idea was to write songs purely for myself. That's it. I wrote 12 songs. I wanted to record them and have them for my own prosperity. Is that right? Yeah, prosperity. So after that, I contacted this guy, Don, who was my friend at the time. And he was still in high school. He was like 16. And we would go, I'd pick him up from high school. And we'd go to my place. And I have my Casio keyboard. He had this real cheap, no-name Flying V guitar. And we'd sit in my bedroom with a boombox that had a tape recorder on it. And we would play. The keyboard had a drum machine on it. So I would set up a beat, play the keyboards, he'd play the guitar, and we'd make these songs. Or he would play them like he was transferring the notes that were on keyboards to guitar. So that's how, and then from that point, I would play like more bass keys on the keyboard, and he would play the guitar part. And we recorded them, and eventually, the girl I was dating at the time, she had known these three guys from Patterson who were not in a band per se, just three guys playing music, a guitar player, bass player, and a drummer. So my friend Don and we approached them. I got the guy's number, and we asked him, said, "Hey, I'm doing some music, and I need a band. Are you interested in doing this?" And they said, "Yeah." And then from that point on, we used to rehearse. It was once a week on a Saturday for about 2 hours, maybe 3. And that was at a place in Fair Lawn called Second City Studios. Remember that place?
It comes up quite a bit in this series. Yeah.
Yeah. That's where we used to rehearse. And eventually, and I saw Dan, the interview you did with Dan. Eventually, Dan asked me if we would be interested in performing on his cable TV show. And sure enough, because at that point I wanted to see what we looked like, because people were asking us, "Are you going to play out?" I had no intention to play out. I didn't. I just wanted to record an album. That was it. So Dan asked if we wanted to play live on his cable show, I don't even know what it was called, but I still have the videotape to this day. And so we did the recording, and at that point, I decided, you know what, I want to do a couple gigs. So we started rehearsing, and then eventually we moved to a different studio, uh, Zounds in Saddlebrook, New Jersey.
Right.
And that's a same place that Danzig started rehearsing as well. Anywho, we started rehearsing there, and I got more serious with it. We recorded a number of tunes that I eventually had pressed into an album, and that's essentially how I really that's the basic start of my band Empire Hideous. But the group of musicians that I had at the time, they were not, they didn't see, they weren't focused like I was. In fact, one of the guys in the band said to me, you know, you've taken what was fun and you've turned it into a job. And I'm like, you know what? We don't need you. Goodbye. And I left. Basically, I didn't leave. They kicked me out. They were like, we don't want to rehearse for you, and we don't want to be in your band anymore. So after having been in their rehearsals, we used to rehearse in this place in Passaic, New Jersey. You remember where Two Tone used to be in
Oh yeah.
by the Capitol?
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So around the corner were these rehearsal studios. Aside from the adult bookstore and the junkies and the hookers that were hanging out everywhere, that's where we were rehearsing. My car got broken into like 3 times. So eventually, that's where we were, and the day came where we did our last 2 shows, which, and I hate to brag, they were real. We were getting tight. We played a show at CBGB's, my first show at CB's on audition night on Monday. There was like 5 people in the audience, but we played a great set. And then the following weekend, we played our last show at the Pipeline on March 12th, 1990.
Mm.
And I was waiting. At this point, my record was already being pressed in Messina, New York State, and was going to be shipped down to me. And I had no band when I got the records. I had no band. It was really kind of heartbreaking, because there's one thing I've always said about any band that wants to make it. If you want to make it, every time you go through a musician change, drummer, bass player, guitar player, singer, keyboard player, whatever, every time you go through that, you lose time. You lose the connection. And eventually, that became the story of my life. Every gig, I'm sorry, every band I had was always the same story. There was always somebody that was leaving, somebody was coming in, somebody was leaving, somebody was coming in, and I had to train these guys all over again. And you just lose that connection. So I mean, right up until just the last time I played in 2019, same situation. I'm like, you know what? I'm done with this. I can't do this anymore. I really can't.
But to that point, Mike, as an outsider looking in and observing Empire Hideous over the years, I learned about you guys around 1990, because that's when I was really getting into the Jersey bands, let's call them. And yeah, there, the faces changed a lot over the years, but you guys were always present in the scene. You were always working, and you were known among other bands as somebody who really put the time in and really made it happen. And, to give a context to people who may be under the age of 30 watching this video, back then we didn't have Bandcamp. We didn't have, let's post a viral
We
video.
didn't have the internet, period.
You know what it was? It was, okay, we have a record. Let's grab our cousins, our girlfriends, our neighbors, and you got a long table somewhere, and you spent all night stuffing records.
That's
Or,
exactly what I did.
right?
I called all my friends, a couple of my cousins, and we all, when the record came delivered to my house, I get this fucking pallet from a truck, all these boxes of EPs, and there were 1,000 of them. I had printed myself, I had printed posters, a lyric sheet, and stickers that all had to go in. And then the record went into a plastic sleeve. So there was like an assembly line around my kitchen table. And I forget how many people were there, but Dan was there, Dan Canzaneri from Electric Frankenstein. And that's what we did for the first record. Everything had to be stuffed in, and that's what you did. That's what you did. And in addition to that, for every gig you played, you made up your own flyers. You brought them to, at the time we didn't have Staples, but we had print shops. And you'd go to the print shop, you'd get them printed up, whether you did it on your own or had them printed through one of those, I forget what they called, offset printer. You'd get them, you'd cut them up. If you didn't, if the print shop didn't cut them for you, you were cutting them with a scissors. Then you were going, after your day of work, then maybe go to rehearsal. After rehearsal, you go to the club that you're going to play at, and you're handing out flyers until 3 o'clock in the morning. That's what we did. No internet, no Instagram, no Facebook, no cell phones, no text messaging, none of that. It was all done in what would the word be? It was all like DIY, but there's a different kind of word I'm looking for that describes how you, like, what it was. It was like a,
Well, it was a very tangible experience. You were creating actual things.
right.
It wasn't just let's post a thing on social media, which I personally hate, but it's a
I
necessity
can't
for
stand it.
people. I miss the old days, man. Like you get the East Coast rocker, or if
Mm-hmm.
you were in the city, you get the Village Voice.
Mm-hmm.
You see the ads. I sat and cut J cards for cassette demos. That's what you did back then. And you had
Yep.
to go out and actually meet people. You'd go to shows.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, people are leaving the gig, you'd hand out the flyers. I don't see any of that anymore.
Nope.
And
And if I may interrupt you for a second, you just mentioned how you'd meet people. I'm sure you've noticed today, the younger generation, and maybe I don't want to stick it to just the younger generation, but the communication skills and social skills of people has diminished.
oh,
All they know how to do is text and Instagram and whatever. That's it. And I hate it. I think it's not only destroying the ability to socialize with others, but it's destroyed music and as well as other things that people used to do, and now it's all done electronically. You're right. It's created a bump in social communication.
mhm. Well, I mean, I can tell you, and you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. The fact that when I was in my early teens through the time the place closed down, one of the key places for me was always the Pipeline. Those Thursday night shows that Emilio put on and then Anthony Trance put on years later.
Yep.
Uh, you were playing the Pipeline, like you mentioned, 1990. Um, because so many people I've spoken to for this channel kind of came up in that scene.
Mm-hmm.
When you look back at the Pipeline, what kind of impact do you think that had for you just as a participant in this whole scene at that point in time?
The Pipeline was the second club I had ever began to go to, because when I first started going to clubs locally, as I said, I was born and raised in Patterson. So the closest club I started hanging out at was the Loop Lounge in Passaic.
Right.
And but that was a different scene. That wasn't so punk rock and gritty. So when I discovered the Pipeline, it was still DJ Freaks. And the first night I went there, I went with my cousin. By the way, my cousin, uh, Tony Malzone. He was in a band called, first he was in a band called the Maniatics. Then he was in a band called Them. Then he was in a band called before that he was in a band called Black Sea. And I had two cousins in that band, Black Sea. One cousin, Augie, on my mother's side, and my cousin Anthony on my father's side. And they weren't related, but they were both my cousins. Anyway, Tony introduced me to bands like Generation X and the Sex Pistols and the Dead Kennedys. And that's how I got into that stuff. And now that I think about it, I was into that before I even met the guy Bruce from Rosemary's Babies, because I was 13, 14 when I was working for my brother, and so was Tony. That's when he introduced me to like bands like Generation X. What I'm getting at is Tony brought me to DJ Freaks the first time, and it was a whole different experience. You know, I wasn't used to it. I didn't know anybody there. Oddly enough, though, the first night I was there, I met this hot chick, and I got her number. She was also about 3 feet taller than I was. So the pipeline, once it changed, there was a period of time when I didn't even go to DJ Freaks, and I was going more to the Loop. And in between that time is when they changed the name. In fact, I think Emilio had a partner with DJ Freaks, and then he bought the guy out, and it became the Pipeline.
Yeah. I mean, that was definitely 86, 87 era for sure. And I want to not correct something, but add to something from the interview I did with Dan, because we were both trying to figure out the name of the doorman.
Bob Cody.
Bob Cody, yeah.
He's a good friend of mine.
Yeah, I wanted to make sure his name was said because it wasn't in that previous interview.
Yeah.
So going back to the band now, I have the first two releases from Empire Hideous. I still listen to them regularly.
Oh.
And Dan made a mention of this in our interview. When you compare the first EP to the second EP, which was on cassette, there was a noticeable change a little bit, musically, because there's a difference between like Wild Wife off the first EP and say Mr. Barnum.
Absolutely.
So how much of that was intentional and how much of it was just a result of the band kind of growing into its own at that point?
Okay, so when I did the first lineup with the band, my initial idea was this is going to be a cross between Alien Sex Fiend and the Misfits. But the guys that were in the band, they weren't into that. Maybe Don was, but the drummer, the bass player, and the guitar player, the lead guitar player, who we didn't even need at all, he was just a waste of time. They weren't into that. They were into like, the guitar player was into like Yngwie Malmsteen, and all these guitar virtuoso, bullshit bands that I couldn't stand. The bass player was into like the Red Hot Chili Peppers and like more funk. And the drummer, he was into like Bauhaus and the Sisters of Mercy, but none of them really knew the deep, dark underground, like the Misfits or Alien Sex Fiend or any of the punk stuff. So even though I had a vision for my band and the sound, it wasn't turning out that way. And I didn't understand. I didn't know. I was still, feeling things out. So that band breaks up. And then I get Dan Canzoneri from Electric Frankenstein, prior to Electric Frankenstein. Renzo, who he mentioned in your interview, Renzo used to live catty corner across the street from me. He was 16 years old. So was Dan, I think. I asked him to join the band. And then we got a drummer who lived on the same street as Glenn Danzig, which was a big deal for me and Dan. Every time we rehearsed at his house, we'd go past Glenn Danzig's house and see the hearse parked in the driveway. Anyway, so the drummer, nice guy, I got nothing against him, but he really didn't understand at all. Like, he didn't know any music that we were into. He was into bands like Cinderella and Poison and all that metal crap that I can't stand. So when he was in the band, we had to try to explain to him, look, no solos, no, just do what we tell you and it'll work out. But it didn't. And eventually we had some issues, and I really regret it to this day. We played a show at, what was it? Escapades in Jersey City. And on the way home, the girl I was with, who would eventually become my wife, she and Dan had an argument. And I ended up telling both of them to shut the hell up. I'm like, both of you, just shut up. The next day, when I got home, the girl who was going to eventually be my wife, she starts complaining about Dan and tells me, he's going to cause problems and this, that, and the other. And like an idiot, I listened to what she said. And I told Dan, I was like, look, it's not going to work out. Actually, that's not even how it happened. I told Renzo that I was going to let Dan go. And I asked him, I said, can you please keep it to yourself before I tell him? But he didn't. He called up Dan. He told him, and Dan called me. He's like, well, I quit. And that was the end of that. And I regret that to this day. I really do. Because Dan was focused. And Dan did have, his connections. And together, we could have really worked out things between us. But again, I was young. I was stupid. I think at that point I was 23, maybe going on 24. And yeah, terrible mistake. I should never have done that. I should never have listened to her by saying, he's going to be bad for the band, and he argued with me, you stand up for me. I made a mistake. It was a terrible mistake.
Well, it was around that time, and this gets into the second Empire Hideous release, the cassette EP, This Evil on Earth.
Right.
So while you guys are doing your thing, there are rumblings coming from Vernon, New Jersey. And when I say rumblings, I mean the sounds of Christian metal. Because as a lot of us do in New Jersey at a certain age, if we're into this stuff, we end up becoming friends with Jerry and Doyle. So, you became friends with those guys. They're doing Christ the Conqueror at the time. But they had a small label they were putting out their own music on called Cyclopean Music. And they ended up getting in the mix with Empire Hideous because they actually put out that cassette for you guys, right?
That's
So
right.
what was their involvement in that whole Cyclopean Music Empire
All
Hideous?
right. So very similar to the first lineup. When I recorded the music for This Evil on Earth, while it was at the press, that's when the band fell apart. So once again, I had another thing coming out, another project coming out, another effort coming out with no band. So the reason we recorded all the songs for This Evil on Earth was because Dan told me his brother Sal, or somebody associated with Sal, was going to put out, they were starting a new record label. And the record label was going to be called Fuck Records. So we recorded, because Dan said, we got to record a song. So we went in and we recorded 3 songs. Went to 4 songs. And when the band fell apart, oh, and by the way, the record label thing never happened. So I was going to do it myself. I do it myself, send it to the press or the recording, and that's when the band fell apart. So I approached Jerry Only. I explained to him what happened. I'm like, look, I need the financial backing to release this EP. I wanted to do it on a record, but he was like, oh, do it on cassette. Records are going out of style. And I said, okay. So we did the cassette, and he paid for it through Cyclopean Records or Cyclopean Music. And that was pretty much it. And to tell you the truth, I was even paying him back. But then when I got married, or told him I was getting married, he said to me, "Don't worry about paying me back. That's your wedding present." Oh, even better. Okay. So, I get the cassette comes out, and that was pretty much it. The only other bands I know that were on that label were Harley from Cro-Mags. His project, one of his projects. That's the only, that and Christ the Conqueror.
Yeah, and there was Slaughtered Grace too.
Right.
Remember the guy Sal B?
Salby
Yeah,
from
Sal B.
what was the name of that band he was in?
Sardonica.
Sorry, Donica. Right.
Yeah.
Yep.
So again, it's like late 80s, early 90s scene. That's when I was first introduced to the Empire Hideous. Probably through the Cyclopean music thing, actually, because I was like a big Misfits head at that point.
Hmm.
Um, and he didn't sound like any other band I was listening to from Jersey. Like you mentioned, the Fiends, their record came out around that time, and of course, too, there was that whole Studio One kind of hair band thing happening in Jersey too.
Right
So,
around the corner from Pipeline.
right. So, like that stuff was happening. But Empire Hideous, to my ears, nobody was sounding like that. You'd have to go to London to listen to a band like that. But here you are in Jersey. All that said, who were some of the bands that Empire Hideous felt a bit of a kinship with in those days, who maybe stylistically fit in with you? 'Cause, I mean, who was around?
Locally,
Yeah, yeah, locally, or maybe even touching into New York a bit.
well, there was one band I found that was I felt closely related to was Sal Cantoneri's band, The Thing.
Mm.
As a matter of fact, before I was even in a band, I was going to audition as lead singer for the Thing. That was back in 1985, 86, probably 85. Um, Granted, it never happened. As a matter of fact, that's how I met Dan. I met Dan through Sal. And to tell you the truth, I can't even remember how I met Sal, whether it might have been through an ad in the Aquarian, or now that I think about it, it might have been, who was the guy that they had play guitar for them? Jim?
For the thing, or
No, no, no. For Electric Frankenstein.
oh, Jim Foster. Jim Foster.
Foster, right. Jim
Yeah, yeah.
Foster and I tried to put a band together way prior to the Empire Hideous. I think I was 18 years old when I was trying to do that. Again, that fell apart too. Let me just answer one of the questions that you asked me that I didn't answer. You asked me the difference between the first album and the second album, right?
Mhm.
After the first record came out and I didn't find any direction with the guys that I had, I started leaning heavily towards gothic rock. And I had all these people who were criticizing me. You got, if you want to be a goth band, you can't look like that, you can't sound like that, you got to write differently. So then I did This Evil on Earth, the album, the EP, and I tried to go in a direction that was more gothic, darker. Um, and then I got criticized for being too gothic. So after that, I I started to not listen to people.
Right.
Pardon me. But yeah, you can definitely hear a difference between the two, especially the production wise. This Evil on Earth is far better produced than the first album, and that was recorded by a guy named Dave Cintron, who
Sure.
lived in Hillcrest section of Patterson before moving to, I think. Well, it doesn't matter. He recorded the Fiends, and that's how I met him, through the Fiends. Anyway, so yeah, all right. So to answer your other question, what bands did I find that were like similar to my band, Empire Hideous? I felt that the Thing was close to it, and we only played like maybe two, possibly three gigs together. Other than that, there were two other bands I was associated with. One of them was called Mescal Rising. You remember Mescal Rising?
I don't. Sure.
Okay, you know who Sunshine Blind are?
Absolutely, yeah.
All right. Charlie, the guitar player, or also known as CWHK, Charlie William Hitchcock Kokornik. That's his name. Um, I saw Mescal Rising play at the Pipeline one night, and I was fucking blown away. I was blown away. Sisters of Mercy with like hard guitars, and they had one of the best drummers I had ever heard. Guy's name was Jim Crew. He was this tribal drummer. Like that's how he played the entire set, every song, and it was just amazing. He actually played with Dan Canzanario and I when we started playing together. And it was me, Dan, and Jim Crew. He left Mescal Rising to play with us. Anyway, so I saw Mescal Rising. I immediately approached Charlie and said to him, listen, man, I'm starting a band. I was still, Empire Hideous hadn't even played a gig yet. And I said, listen, I'd love to hang out with you. Can we chat? And we became friends. I used to go hang out at his apartment in Passaic. I mean, fucking awesome apartment. Him and his drummer, Jim, and his bass player, known as Cousin Al, they all lived together in this fucking crazy looking apartment. Had posters everywhere on the ceilings, on the walls, on the doors. Just this crazy apartment. And I would hang out with them for long periods of time. We'd smoke pot and listen. He'd turn me on to like bands like the Swans, Red Lorry, Yellow Lorry, and I forget what else. Then there was a girl named Vicky who worked at a record store called Sound Exchange.
Yep.
She was in a band with her brother called This Ordeal. You remember them?
Yeah.
All right, very, very sound Joy Division-ish type band. So I would go to Sound Exchange like every Saturday or Sunday, mostly on Sundays, and I would spend like $80 in records. And once Vicky was there, she would give me discounts, so I'd get even more records. Anyhow, knowing that she had a band, I asked her, I said, listen, I'm starting a band. I know Charlie from Mescal Rising, and of course you with This Ordeal. I said, I have an idea. So I invited Charlie and his band, and Vicky, her brother, and their band to my house when I lived in Patterson at my parents' house for a meeting. And I said to him, I have an idea for the three of us. I wanted to start what would the proper name be? A coalition, maybe. 3 bands. And the title was called Tri-Omen Apparition. And it was the 3 bands that worked together. So in other words, every gig, if they got a gig, they would insist that Mescal Rising and Empire Hideous played with them. If Mescal Rising got a gig, the same thing. This Ordeal and Empire Hideous would play with them. Now, I had not gotten a gig yet because I had never played a show. So I said to him, if we work together, we can, do gigs and get better promotion. So, and we had this thing too, like we would take turns. First band, might be Mescal Rising, and then This Ordeal and Empire Hideous. And that's how the first show ended up working out. The second show we played was This Ordeal, Mescal Rising, and Empire Hideous. And then by the third show, Empire Hideous, Mescal Rising, and This Ordeal. And that was the last show I played with the original lineup. So that was, I don't know if we sounded like Mescal Rising, but we certainly didn't sound like This Ordeal. My whole point is that those are the 2 bands that I approached to try to work together in the New Jersey circuit, to answer your question.
That's really cool. That's really cool.
Thank you.
And because the world is incredibly small, my next guest on this channel is Jim Foster.
Oh my gosh. That's so weird.
Yeah.
What's he doing these days?
He is playing with Adrenaline OD again.
No kidding.
Yep, they're doing a
Didn't Dave die recently, or one of the guys die from AOD, adrenaline overdose?
No. As a matter of fact, I just interviewed Dave this week.
Who am I
Uh,
thinking of? Agent
not
Orange or something? I don't even know. Never mind.
Yeah, all as far as I know, all the guys who were in the classic lineup of AOD and the original lineup are all still with us. But yeah, Jim's back with them for a few shows coming up.
Please give him my regards, please.
I will. Yeah, small world, man.
Ask him about the day him and I met for the first time in Willowbrook Mall parking lot.
I will.
He's gonna tell you I showed up, had my devil locked down. I was trying to look all bad and cool, you know.
Yeah, I'll definitely do that, and I'll make sure when I post, I'll send you the link too.
Please, please.
And speaking of these first two Empire Hideous releases, you just recently, like in the last couple weeks, sold the final copies of those two releases on your web.
It only took 30 years. What?
But I had them already, so I didn't have a
Good.
need to jump on it. But I did notice that you were kind of putting that chapter in the past
Yeah,
officially.
how to get rid of them.
Um,
You know, when I joined the Misfits, that record was going for $150
mm,
at the time. I don't know what it's going for now, but now that there's no more, I'm sure, not to toot my own horn, but I'm sure that it will be some sort of a collector's item at some point in time.
yeah,
Maybe, hopefully.
yeah. Well, since you mentioned the M word, let's go there a little bit. Now, as I said in the beginning, you do have a book and you devote a fair amount of space in the book to your experiences as singer for the Misfits.
That's right.
So people can read the book, and I mean, look, I'll preface it too by saying, I know quite a bit of that history. I have my own personal history with that bunch. Um, I still talk to Doyle like once a year. Still tight with Chud, that whole thing. So no beef on this end.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I'll say this as a general statement: it's hard to be in a band, and it's really hard to be in that band.
Yes. That's why I wrote a book about it.
Exactly. So to kind of take a different spin on that, because until the reunion happened with Gwen in 2016 through now, the biggest audiences the Misfits ever played for happened when you were the front man for that band. I think that's an
At
important.
that time, yes. At
Yeah,
that time.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that was the biggest crowds that band had seen was when you were singing for them. So,
Yep.
you know, like I said, I know the characters. I'll leave it there.
Okay.
But what do you consider, looking back on that experience now, the real pleasures and highlights that you hold dear from being part of that band and part of that legacy? Because you're forever going to be part of the legacy of that band. And it's an
Well, it depends. If you ask Jerry and Doyle, they won't even mention my name. In fact, Jerry will say that I was a thorn in his side for that. But the truth of the matter is, I was the one that helped them save two tours, two national tours on two different continents. Because if it hadn't been for me, they may have had to cancel it. And Jerry kept saying, "Oh, I'll sing," meaning him. Um, well, before it became the Jerry only band, uh, he didn't have the ability to sing. As a matter of fact, and I don't mind saying this, he is tone deaf. He cannot sing in key, and he goes off key constantly. And that's because he's deaf. They've been playing for, what is it, 50 years now? Never used earplugs, and he is deaf. So, and so is Doyle, for that matter. Um, and not to get off the subject, but the first show I played with them in Scotland, I walked down on stage and Doyle hit that guitar and my brains literally flew out of my ear. That's how loud they were. And that night I came off stage, my ears were ringing until for like a week. And I said that night after the show, I was like, I'm wearing earplugs in my ears from now on. And what I would do is I would take the foam ones and I'd cut them in half so that they go really far in my ears and you couldn't see them. And that helped me significantly. But them, they're, I'm sorry to say, but Jerry has ruined himself by not protecting his ears, and they play at top volume. One of the funny things that Jerry has always said about their guitars that they make, so he's so proud of this. He's like, yeah, this is our new guitar, and you can see it's got no volume buttons. You just plug it in, and that's it. So when you plug it in, it's like, I don't know if that's a good feature, but that's what he's proud of.
Well, there had to have been some fun moments for you.
There was. When I first got in the band with them, Jerry, now mind you, I knew them for 11 years prior to joining the band in 98. And when I first was part of it, Jerry treated me like his little brother. And that felt good, knowing that he was on my side and helping me out. He really looked out for me, always patting me on the back and this, that, and the other. It wasn't Jerry, from what I understand, it wasn't Jerry who didn't want me in the band. It was Doyle and Chud. They didn't want me in the band. They wanted Michael in the band. And I never could understand that, because here's a guy, and I got nothing, well, now I do, but I never had anything against Michael Graves until 2011. Here's a guy who quits the band and doesn't want to go on tour for what would have been their biggest shows in South America. And I was like, well, I kind of understand why he didn't want to go, because he was getting fed up with Jerry too. I mean, not for nothing, but when your own brothers quit because they can't deal with you, that says a lot. But I'm not going to get into that. The good things that I liked was being treated like an equal. Even though I was never invited to any band meeting, I wasn't paid properly, I was never given the contract that I was supposed to be given. And then after 2 weeks, maybe 3, that whole brotherly love thing went right down the hill. And that was because Doyle and Chud were harassing, giving him a hard time, saying, we don't want Myke in the band. Hideous, that is. We want Michael Graves. And I was like, all right, okay. I felt excluded. I felt cheated. I certainly felt cheated. Because as I said, I didn't get paid the money I should have gotten paid. I didn't like get invited to any of the band meetings, basically because the band meetings were about me. And they, doing the shows that I did, I wasn't used to singing punk rock songs like that. 30 songs in a row. Mm-hmm. Nonstop. 1 full hour of high velocity music. I wasn't used to it. On top of that, if you compare the vocals in Empire Hideous to the Misfits, I actually sing in Empire Hideous. I use vibrato, whereas in the Misfits, it's punk rock. Mm-hmm. And yet they would always say to us, or say to me, we want you to sound like Tom Jones. I'm like, what the fuck? What do you mean Tom Jones? All their albums didn't sound like Tom Jones was singing them. So I had a real hard time with trying to understand where they got that from. Anyway, yeah, so there were a couple of good things about it. Touring, getting to play in front of 100,000 people over the course of a couple of months, that was a big deal. It catapulted my career as an independent performer. I was still selling my music, because once I got out of the band, people were like, oh, who the hell is this guy? Let me get his CDs. And that's what I got from it. I think I got more headache from it than anything, though.
Mm, mm. Yeah. Yeah, I can see that.
It's not easy working for those guys.
I did it for a year and a half.
Hmm?
Yeah, yeah.
Especially when one brother is the guitar player and the other brother was the manager.
Mhm.
You got three people. It's family. How are you going to go? How can you make a comment against somebody else who's family? You
Right.
can't. And if you do, you're out.
Have you seen them since Glenn came back?
The only time I saw, yeah, as a matter of fact, I did. I saw Doyle when I was doing my film Living the American Nightmare. We went down. We were supposed to interview Glenn Danzig when they played a gig down, I think in Sayreville, New Jersey. I can't remember. So they, so here, all right. So Doyle had his own band, whatever it was called at the time, and Michael Graves was singing for him. Danzig was playing that night. They were opening for Danzig.
I remember that show. Yeah.
All right, so I'm there before the whole night starts, and I'm sitting there and I'm just waiting for the opportunity where we can interview Glenn, which, by the way, never happened. Doyle sees me. I said hello to Steve Zing. I said hello to a couple other guys. I said hello to Chud. Doyle sees me. He comes over. Now, Doyle's a monster. Okay, he's gigantic. I thought he was going to kill me. I really thought he was going to punch me in the nose because I didn't say a lot of flattering things about him. I was pissed at him. I'm over it now. I couldn't care less. But he walks up to me. He pulls out stretches out his gigantic muscle-bound arms and hugs me. He's
Hmm.
like, "Hey man, how you doing?" Because they knew my history, my health, and cancer. And he's like, "How you doing, man? Everything okay?" Whether it was a sincere comment, you know, or not, I don't know. But that was the first time I had seen him since my involvement with the band in '98. So there's that. And then the other time, my guitar player from Spy Society and Empire Hideous, Jason Trioxin, he died. And
Right.
when he died, I was at his wake. And I'm standing there talking to Kenny Kayafa, the Misfit brother.
Hmm.
And as I'm standing there, Jerry walks in. Now, Jerry has said some bad shit about me. And whatever. I said some bad shit about him, but he refuses to understand why I said it. In any event, I'm standing there talking to Kenny. Jerry walks in, says hello to his brother Kenny. Then he looks at me and he shakes my hand. I shook his hand back. I'm like, "How you doing, man?" And that was the end of that. And we moved on.
Yeah. Yeah. Kind of is what it is. I personally, I mean, this is just me talking out of my ass based on what I've experienced with the guy. I, I, I would imagine that hug from Doyle was sincere because he does that, man. He comes out of left field and actually surprises you by how like thoughtful he can be at times.
Yeah.
It's the funny thing with him. I was telling Dave Scott from AOD. I was at Pro Edge one day, and it was Kenny, the other two, and Chud. Everybody's busting balls. I was like 17 at the time. And Doyle said something to me. I can't remember what he said, but it was an insult. And my sensitive 17-year-old mind couldn't take it. But a few minutes go by, and I go over to Doyle. Now, like you said, Doyle's like 10 feet tall.
Hmm.
And I'm like a 17-year-old kid with, green hair and glasses. And I go over to him, I go, you know, Doyle, man, what you said to me was really fucked up. And like he got this and he starts kicking the ground. He's like, "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean nothing by it. I was only kidding." So you never know with that bunch.
I don't. Yeah, I never could. I could never really tell what was going on either. So yeah, I get it.
Yeah. But again, referring back to your book, and again, the links will be in the video description. You've done quite a bit beyond the Empire Hideous era we've talked about. Certainly, you've done a lot since the Misfits. You had Spy Society 99, awesome band. You
Thank you.
worked Bronx Casket Company with Dee Dee from Overkill. You brought back the Empire Hideous a couple of times. And you worked on a documentary film. All this is in the book. And I really do want people to read the book because not only is it a great history of the era in Jersey that we've been talking about, but it's really a chronicle of an independent artist navigating the industry. And there's some great people that turn up. Pete Steele comes up in the book, rest in peace, Pete.
Mm.
There's a lot of cool things in this book to take in. So kind of bypassing the post Misfits years and going straight to kind of the present. Um, I know around 2019 you kind of put the kibosh on performing live and doing music, but that's changed again because you just recently performed in Jersey, right? Like in the last month or so.
Just one song. There's a new single that's coming out, a song that I wrote called "The Ages." I recorded it with a band called October Noir,
Yeah, they're
N
great.
Noir. Um, they played at a gothic rock or gothic festival in Parsippany, New Jersey, April 21st, in Florida. And they asked me if I would, do the song with them live. Um, and so I said, okay. I mean, initially, I just wanted to go there and take some pictures of them.
Mhm.
Um, but they asked me if I wanted to do the song. And so I met them there and we took some pictures. Um, and then they played. I came up. I did one song with them, and that was the end of that. So the single is coming out with luck, I think, in a week or two.
Mm.
As a matter of fact, the cover art is mine, and it's only a single. It's got three versions of the same song. Um, and there's going to be posters, 11 by 17 posters of the cover of my artwork that the lead singer Tom is sending to me now. In fact, he sent them today. No, yesterday, so I should get them by tomorrow. That I have to sign, and then I'll send them back to him. So there's only 100 CDs. That's it.
Mm.
um, and they're gonna sell them. I know they've sold almost at least half of them, if not more, at this point. Uh, and you get a free poster with the CD single. So yeah, I'm done. I really don't have any tolerance anymore to do music. Certainly don't have the money. My life has changed. When I retired from music, one of the first few things I did was I bought birds. I bought, in that case back then, I bought a parrot, and there was no way I was going to be able to go on tour and stay away from home with a bird like that. So I had made the conscious decision to say, all right, that's it. I'm done. 2008, I quit. I'm done with music. I had the birds. I got cats. I had snakes. I mean, because I'm an animal lover, and uh, so that was the end of my career. Since then, I did a couple of gigs with it. I wouldn't say a reunion with Empire Hideous, but we played a couple of gigs back in 2019, and then of course uh, the China virus hit, and that was the end of that. And I'm like, you know what? It's always something. It's always something. The same thing with the last album that I put out, which is entitled "Just a Matter of Time." No, sorry, that's the wrong one. The Time Has Come. Yes, um, and Peter Steele. That's the album. Peter Steele offered to produce for me, and he died working on that CD. Not many people know that. Peter
Mm.
Steele died doing pre-production on my final album entitled "The Time Has Come." So I'm like, you know what? I'm done. I can't do this anymore. I fucking every time I try to do something, it's just a complication. It's like the planets never align for me. So whatever. I'm done.
Well, I love October Noir. I think they've got an interesting vibe. Definitely that Peter Steele aesthetic, alive and well in that band's music. Um,
Absolutely.
Looking forward to hearing, your collaboration with them for sure. Before we wrap up, I did want to mention the fact that you are doing a podcast yourself these days.
Yes and no.
Okay.
Um, Started a podcast called Finding the Truth with Myke Hideous. Um, and we've kind of been on hiatus since the beginning of April. In fact, right before the beginning of April. So I really don't know what's happening at this point. We're going to try to get some more episodes out, but things are kind of complicated right now, which I really don't have an answer for you. Um, so hopefully, fingers crossed, we will get back into the rotation or schedule, if you will, and continue doing. Now, believe it or not, the drummer from October Noir, Tyler Fleming, him and I have discussed doing a music podcast associated with like reviewing, not so much reviewing, but discussing classic albums, like great albums. Like, just for example, like we might pick up like an album from him, or I'm just throwing this out there, like maybe Metallica's first album, Kill 'Em All, and then talking about it and playing a couple of songs from that album. Again, it's all in the working right now, so we don't have anything planned as of yet of when it's going to come out. But yeah, Tyler from October Noir and I are considering doing a show as well. So yeah, I also do I do a podcast, a thing on YouTube called the Michael Decon Program, and I've been doing that now for, oh wow, I have been doing that now since I think about 2020, and I'll tell you, I love doing that show with Michael because it is, we have such a blast when we do that show. I mean, he makes me laugh. He's got such a dark sense of humor. And the funny thing is, I make him laugh, which is rare because I hardly ever hear the guy laugh. But I have that ability to make him laugh. I do actually have a sense of humor, despite contrary to what popular belief may be. I actually do have a sense of humor.
So, do you have guests on this podcast? Is it kind of like a talk show format?
On the Michael Deacon program,
Hmm.
yeah, every once in a while. But mostly him and I try to do it just ourselves because I found it that when he had a guest, I felt like a third wheel. So I said, you know what? Why don't you do your interviews? And every once in a while, him and I will do one together. But I kind of refrain from that because we do so much between each other. And then we take calls and people call in and everything. And that's interesting too, the interesting calls that we get.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, it's awesome that you've got so many things going on in the here and now. Um, but I really appreciate you coming on and talking about some of the earlier years and,
Of
the
course,
growth that
of
I
course.
eventually came up in and the early years of the Empire Hideous. And as I said, there will be a bunch of links in the video description of Mike's various projects. So I would encourage viewers to check that out. But until we meet again, Myke, thank you so much for your time. It's been nice connecting with you again.
My pleasure, Joel. It's good to connect with you after all these years. Good
Absolutely.
luck with everything.
Let's not wait another 20 years. Yeah.
Indeed.
Take care, man.